Thanks for coming. We're delighted to have Professor Joe Stiglitz and Dr. Robert Johnson here with us today. Many of you are probably familiar with Professor Stiglitz. He is a professor at Columbia University, an Amherst College grad, a member of our board of trustees, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, former chief economist of the World Bank, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001 for some important new economic thinking, and many, many other things besides. And Dr. Johnson is the executive director of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and we're very happy to have him here today to talk to us about the Institute and their plans for it. Thank you very much for being here.
Great. Is this working? Good. Well, thank you for joining us today. We'll start off by talking a little bit with Professor Stiglitz about economics, obviously in the aftermath of the crash of 2008 and 9. What you might call quality of economic stewardship in our society has come into question. And while many people are, how I say, I used to work in the hedge fund business. If you go around and say you're a hedge fund guy or a banker, they want to put you in jail. If you're an economist, they just want you to eat in the garage. But I'm here today with Joe to try to encourage you all to reconsider, because I think it's an extraordinary time to become an economist. And how would I say, being here at Amherst, being the next Joe Stiglitz isn't a bad thing to aspire to. So at any rate, why don't we start with Joe talking about the state of economics and his perceptions, and then I'll come back and talk with you a little bit about this new institute, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, that we've set up, and how we can engage you and continue the conversation thereafter. And obviously, we'll try to create a good deal of time for question and answer. You ready, Joe Stiglitz?
Good. Well, let me begin talking a little bit about the economic crisis. One of the exercises right now is a discussion of who's to blame, and very clearly the financial sector, the bankers, are to blame. And it's actually interesting when I talk in New York City, and there are all these bankers in the audience. They all agree that the other bankers were to blame. So I always feel nervous when I give this talk, and they never seem to get angry with me. They all agree that the financial sector failed. They also all agree that the government failed. The regulators didn't stop the bankers from doing what they've always done, which is get us into trouble. So there's a long history of financial crises, and there's only been about a 35-year period in the history of capitalism in which there has not been a crisis, and that was the 35 years after the Great Depression, when we adopted laws like the Glass-Steagall Act, the Securities and Exchange Commission, that worked. And they worked so well that people came to believe that we didn't need them. Because they worked so well, we didn't have crises. And the conclusion from the fact that we didn't have any crises is that we didn't need to prevent them. And so they got rid of these laws. And not surprisingly, in the 30 or so years after deregulation, stripping away the regulation, around the world there have been over 120 crises. So it's quite clear that I think that the regulations played a role. Most of those crises have been in developing countries, emerging markets, but there have been a few in the advanced industrial countries, Scandinavia. The United States had an S&L crisis, and then America always does things bigger and better than anybody else, and the 2008 crisis was really bigger and better than any of those that had happened in the last 75 years. But in discussing who is to blame, I am in my book Freefall, which I hope all of you will buy, in my book, and it's just out in paperback, I should mention, in my book Freefall, I have a chapter in which I blame the economics profession. Again, it's other economists that were to blame. And I really think that's true, that economists provided much of the arguments that were used by policymakers in support of deregulation, and many of the theories that were used by those in financial markets. So in many ways, economists were really, you might say, the godfathers of this crisis. This, not surprisingly, is partly a contentious view because those economists have devoted their lives to creating the crisis, like to think of this as just an accident, which no one could have anticipated, no one could have predicted, even though some people did predict it. It's just something that happened to the economy, not something that the financial sector, regulators, and economists made. But I feel very strongly that this was a man-made event. Well, this has instigated a certain amount of soul searching, but not too much. Because when people have devoted their life to a certain thing, they don't want to think too deeply about whether they've made a mistake. There was one very dramatic moment when Alan Greenspan testified before Congress. And let me go back a second and talk about an example of how economists played a role. One of the things that clearly contributed to the current crisis was the bubble. And the world has been marked by lots of bubbles since the tulip bulb mania. Rob and I, teacher, both our teacher at MIT, was Charlie Kinderberger, who wrote a very good book about
manias, panics, and crashes.
Yeah, manias, panics, and crashes, and going back to the tulip bulb mania. So they're going to happen over and over again. But one of the interesting features of the school that became dominant in the economics profession, the rational expectation school, a school focusing on rationality, was that you couldn't have bubbles. Never mind the fact that we've had them over and over again. They said they couldn't exist. Why? Because bubbles are irrational, and therefore, since markets are rational, QED, bubbles don't exist. And that made life very easy because as a policymaker, you didn't have to worry about bubbles. So when Alan Greenspan was asked, as the bubble was growing, and I was writing and other people were writing that, there's really a problem here, Alan Greenspan was asked, is there a bubble? And he said, no, just a little froth. Now, of course, in retrospect, one of the things about modern media is that you're always being taped, and what you say at one point is going to come back to haunt you. And so now they have these videos after the market crashed, and you say, oh, no, it's not a bubble, just a little froth. Well, there are a whole series of doctrines of monetary and regulatory policy that were based on a set of ideas that came out of these views of perfect markets. And if we have time, we can talk about some of that. For now, I just want, finally, after the bubble broke and he was asked to testify, Alan Greenspan said, I made a mistake because I thought rational self-interest would prevent the kind of risk-taking that has occurred. And it was fairly big, viewed as a very big confession. But what was so interesting is that if he had used even a little bit of economic analysis, he would have realized that he should have expected this bad behavior. And if he thought about what was going on, he should have been worried about the models that he and all the people in the Federal Reserve Board were using. Because if you look at the incentive structures that those in the financial sector had, The financial structures incentives that they had were incentives that led to excessive risk-taking and short-sighted behavior. If they hadn't led to that kind of behavior, we would have had to rewrite our microeconomics textbooks. So the good news of the crisis is that we don't have to rewrite our textbooks. What you're learning is in micro is probably right. What you may be learning in macro is almost surely wrong, unless you have the right course, and I hope you have the right course. I want to ask some of your faculty here. Somebody's raising their eyebrow. The point is that many of the macro courses left out these kinds of problems. I'll give some others a little bit later. And so they assumed that there wasn't this kind of excessive risk-taking, that the microstructures were incentivizing. But what's even, so Greenspan didn't ever look at what the incentive structures were, and as an economist, you would have thought that that's one of the first things he should have done. But the second thing that he should have asked is, why are there these incentive structures that should lead the managers of the banks, the executives of the bank, to behave in ways that are not consistent with our shareholders and our bondholders? So there was a problem here of incentives in creating incentives. And we all know what that problem is. It's a problem of corporate governance, which is pervasive in our economy, but means that the simple microeconomic models where there's a close correspondence between ownership and control are wrong. And macroeconomic behavior that ignores this is wrong. So to me, what came as a surprise in a way was Greenspan's surprise, because I would have thought that he would have recognized these two problems. But there was something else that in a way was very surprising about Greenspan's statement, because in explaining where he went wrong, he left out something that was very important. And that is the question, why do we have regulation in the first place? If I go to gamble, it has consequences to me and my family, and we want to make sure the regulation is not dishonest. But that risk-taking has no further consequences to our society. Is that clear? But why do we stop excessive risk-taking from banks? We stop excessive risk-taking, bad behavior in banks because the banks are entrusted with other people's money, and when they go bankrupt or have problems, the rest of our society suffers. So in other words, banks are regulated because there are externalities. And Greenspan didn't recognize the concept of externalities, didn't recognize that was the reason why we have regulation. And if you have regulators who don't understand why you have regulation, in fact, don't believe in regulation, you're not going to get good regulation. And I should point out, he was appointed to be a regulator because they wanted somebody who didn't believe in regulation. Before his appointment, we did have a regulator who did believe in regulation. We had a regulator who brought down the inflation rate from double-digit levels, the head of the Fed, to very moderate levels. You would have thought, having done that he would have been, get a National Medal of Honor, reappointed, and yet Reagan looked for somebody who was not going to regulate the financial system because the previous person, Paul Volcker, understood why you need regulation. Well, many of the models that economists used and that became fashionable in macroeconomics for an extended period of time, there's a somewhat a move away from it, actually were designed in a way that excluded the possibility of externalities. And those are the models that are called representative agent. I don't know, do you teach those models here? It's a blank look. Okay. So models where there's a representative agent, a single person that is a representative of the whole economy, and you analyze their behavior, and from analyzing their behavior, you look at the macro behavior of the economy. Well, what's so interesting in those models that were very fashionable in economics for a very long while is that, first, you can't have a financial sector in those models. That's very interesting, because if you have only one person, to have a financial sector, you have to have somebody giving money from one person to another. If you have only one person, you can only take money out of your left pocket and put it in your right pocket. But if that's the case, you never have any problem with bankruptcy, right? I mean, you're not going to be able to default, because if you're defaulting, you're only not paying yourself, right? So the whole issues of financial markets, default, all these issues that were central to this crisis are issues that were completely pushed aside and not incorporated into the standard models. And these were models that were used over and over again by macroeconomists. But I'll come back to some other properties. But before that, what I wanted to lay on the table is that, well, I think that the economics profession really failed in a number of ways in leading up to the crisis and providing economic advice. This is not a universally shared view. And just a couple of weeks ago, Ben Bernanke, who is the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board and the person at the helm as the car went into the crash, and many people think have a great deal of culpability. Even if he managed to get us a little bit out of the ditch, we are in very bad shape, and clearly was at the driver's seat when the accident occurred, and in much of the period before the accident occurred. His view is that economics is fine, that nothing went wrong. It wasn't economic science that went wrong. Let me read a couple paragraphs from his speech. He said, "I would argue that the recent financial crisis was more a failure of economic engineering and economic management than of what I have called economic science." In other words, some people down on Wall Street didn't read his papers carefully enough, didn't read, and some of the regulators didn't do their work carefully, but the models of the gurus of the economic profession, the economic science, got it right. I think that is wrong. He went on to say, he goes on and he says, in the realm of economic management, the leaders of financial firms, market participants, and government policies either did not recognize important structural problems and emerging risks, or when they identified them, did not respond sufficiently quickly or forcefully to address them. Shortcomings of what I have called economic science, in contrast, were for the most part less central to the crisis. Indeed, although the great majority of economists did not foresee their near collapse of the financial system, economic analysis has proven and will continue to prove critical in understanding the crisis, in developing policies to contain it, and in designing longer-term solutions to prevent its recurrence. So from his point of view, economic science has done splendidly. As I say, I think actually many parts of economics, particularly the mainstream of economic policy making, the ideas that prevailed at the Federal Reserve Board and administration across parties, really did have a great deal to do with the crisis in shaping the policy frameworks, in shaping the mindsets. And that is why there's this initiative, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, that's trying to invest large amounts of money to try to change the paradigm. Let me spend a few minutes talking about a couple of other examples of assumptions that illustrate how models shape our thinking, and the choice of models almost presumes the policy conclusion, so that when you make the model, you've really answered the question. And so that, as I said before, if you think that markets are efficient, you're not going to try to stop markets from being irrational. another example, I was talking about the representative agent model, where there can't be externalities, there can't be financial markets. One other aspect of the representative agent model that is very bad is that you can't have redistribution. If everybody's the same, inequality is not a problem. Or you can't address problems of inequality within the model, is a more precise way. One of the things that I was the chair of a UN commission that looked into the sources of the economic crisis and proposed a set of reforms that Rob was also on. And one of the things that we argued very strongly, that one of the factors contributing to the crisis was growing inequality in the United States and most countries around the world. And the link is pretty easy to understand, that when you have growing inequality, in effect, you're redistributing money from people who would spend it to people who don't spend all of it. And what's happened in the United States in that respect is very dramatic. The data that just came out 2 weeks ago pointed out that median income in the United States, the household in the middle, median income in the United States last year, the data that just came out in 2009, was lower than it was in 1997. So there's been decline in median income, and this was actually even true before the crisis. But median income in the United States has been stagnating or declining for more than a decade. Growth, there's been growth in per capita income, but all the growth in per capita income has gone to the top. Well, one way of interpreting what happened in the crisis is the country said, in effect, to those at the bottom, the middle, even those above the middle, don't let this bother you that your income is stagnating. You can still live the life of the American dream. Just keep spending as if your income was going up. And America did that very well. Well, how do you keep spending income as if your income is spending money as if your income is going up when your income is going down? Debt. And if you look at what's happened to our debt, it soared. So that was what was going on. Now, the housing bubble that the Fed was supporting throughout this period made them feel good, because they could at the same time see increasing debt, but say to themselves, my assets are also going up. I have money for retirement to send my kids to college. But that assets were all bubble prices. And now in the aftermath of the crisis, they are left with the legacy of the debt. So the point I want to make is that these are all issues in which the crisis is very intimately related to distribution, and the consequence of the crisis is redistribution. And one of the problems of getting out of the crisis is that distribution of income is getting worse, not better. Well, if you have a representative agent model, it's very difficult to address these key issues of distribution. Let me just very briefly talk about two other assumptions that were really are even more central to what has gone on. One of them is the assumption of rational expectations and broader assumptions of extreme rationality. Now, anybody that's looked at what's happened in the markets has to raise questions. There were at least some people who were not rational, including many of the people in the financial markets who made bets that were extraordinarily stupid. If you read a book like if you read any of this book about what's going on in the financial markets, you will see extraordinarily irrationality on the part of, that's actually a gentle word, on the part of people who were supposed to be extraordinarily smart. But again, the assumptions of rationality lead to certain implications, policy implications. If people are perfectly informed and perfectly rational, then you don't need any consumer protection legislation. And a key part of this crisis was predatory lending. The banks were predating on the poorest Americans, and credit card debt and all other kinds of debt in contracts that even a PhD can't figure out. So, you look at the contracts and it's very clear they were designed to be deceptive. They were designed to fool people. So, again, if you said, well, rationality, why don't markets protect themselves? Well, they failed. And it's a good question about why they failed. But there is a really need for collective action, government, consumer protection to stop this. Finally, as one other aspect of the models which were prevalent are the strong assumptions of perfect competition, high degrees of competition. Well, one of the things that you learn about in models that lots of, again, strong policy conclusions and strong implications. One of the assumptions of perfect competition is that there should be no rents. But you look at the financial sector, there are very large ranks. Just yesterday, they distributed 1% of GDP to a relatively few people. And you have to look at that as ranks that they somehow got. If you look at, just again, to go back, I don't want to harp on the credit cards, but I do want to harp on it. Every time you do a transaction in the credit card, the merchant gets charged anywhere from 1.5% to 4% of the transaction. It's a tax on every transaction, but it's a tax that doesn't go to public purpose, it goes to the banks. Clearly an anti-competitive practice. Governments elsewhere have stopped this, but our banks, with their strong lobby, have stopped those who have tried to stop this. And so in the financial reform bill, there was a little bit of move in the right direction, a recognition of a problem, almost nothing, though, that was done. And this particular thing generates by itself something like, I think, about $40 billion of profit a year. This little pennies adding up. Well, again, if you believe, you write down models that assume perfect competition, what is the implication of policy for antitrust laws? You don't need antitrust laws if markets are perfectly competitive. And this has been extraordinarily influential in the policy sphere. The Supreme Court has made decisions saying, since markets are competitive, certain kinds of practices are prima facie illegal because they couldn't survive in a competitive world, when the issue is whether the world is competitive. So people, we sometimes call the Chicago School, has been extraordinarily influential. Well, all of these are examples of what's wrong with the standard paradigm, and if you look at the crisis itself, I think is probably the strongest piece of evidence that the economics profession, at least in macro and finance, didn't work well. So criticizing economics, providing a critique of what went wrong, is in a way the easiest part of the analysis. I think the real hard part is figuring out how to construct an alternative paradigm. An alternative paradigm that provides a better description and on the basis of which one can derive better policies for what to do. And the good thing is that over the last 30, 40 years, a lot of the building blocks of this alternative paradigm, alternative paradigms, have been built up. But they didn't get incorporated into a lot of the mainstream. More of them in micro than macro. Macro has been extraordinarily resilient, and it's really, those of you who are sociologists, I think it's a wonderful field to study economics as a sociology and the resistance to new ideas among economists. I actually have a postdoc working with me who's studying central bankers as a tribe. Because they have peculiar customs, language, they have their own language, belief systems, and I think the only way you can understand them is not based on economic science, but really as a tribe with their own peculiarities. The unfortunate thing about this particular tribe is that it affects the lives of the rest of us. If they just stayed up lived in their own life and they're often in some remote place, that would be fine. But unfortunately, they're scattered around the world in every capital and causing problems for the rest of our society. That probably was not a nice comment. Well, let me try to illustrate two examples of attempts, for instance, on my part, but there are lots of attempts going on by a variety of people to reconstruct a more positive, a more accurate, a better macroeconomics based on more reasonable assumptions, with coming to, I think, a better interpretation of what is going on. The first example has to do with some of what is going on today and what has gone on in financial stability. One of the big mistakes that is related to the financial meltdown has to do with securitization. And securitization, those who are economists know, you take portfolios of mortgages, for instance, and you put them together, and then you sell them out, and you diversify the risk. And these are the areas where our financial markets and our rating agencies believed in what I call financial alchemy. You know, alchemy in the Middle Ages, where you took lead and you converted it into gold. Well, modern financial alchemy is you take F-rated subprime mortgages, you bless it with a blessing of Goldman Sachs or another investment bank and a credit rating agency, and so all of a sudden it's AAA rated and good enough to be held in a pension fund. This is really alchemy, and I hope some of you go out in the market and do some of this. You get paid very well for this alchemy. I've always, when I jokingly say when I gave 3 lectures on securitization, the first lecture talked about the benefits of diversification and distributing risk. And it was after the first lecture that all these students ran down to Wall Street to make money. But they didn't go to the second and the third lecture. And the second and third lecture, I explained why it didn't work. And the second lecture, I point out that this doesn't work so well if the risks are correlated. And there are a lot of macroeconomic shocks that are correlated. So if interest rates go up, it affects all mortgages across the country if you have variable rate mortgages. If unemployment rate goes up nationally, the economy goes into recession, it affects the whole country. They said, we've never had a shock so large that it affects the entire country. What do they mean it never happened? Now, they hadn't remembered the Great Depression. What do they mean by that is in their data set that went back about 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. But obviously, big shocks don't happen every year. They happen every 25, 50, 75 years. So they used a data set that was too short. But this is an example of a real, what happens when you don't study economic history. They took a very, very short-sighted view. And in fact, this again was a kind of intellectual inconsistency because they believed at the time that their financial innovations had transformed the global economy, the economy. Well, if they had transformed the economy was fundamentally different, which is why they deserve such high salaries, then it could not be the case the data before they had transformed it would tell you about the world after they had transformed it, right? But they forgot about that little detail. In fact, they had transformed the economy, and this is what they would have learned in the third lecture, that if you have that when you diversify like this and you securitize, you give rise to a problem called moral hazard. You change incentives. In the old world, when people issued a mortgage, they kept it, they had a strong incentive to make sure it was a good loan. With securitization, you undermine incentives for good mortgages. And economists believe incentives matter. If you have incentives for bad mortgages, you create bad mortgages. And let me tell you, it's a lot easier to manufacture bad things than good things. And our financial markets were really fantastic in manufacturing bad mortgages. So, as I say, what they did is they had changed the world. The probabilities of defaults were much higher than they had been historically, and predictably so. And it was predicted that they would so. And then the whole thing came apart. Well, what was interesting is that they so believed these models of diversification, so believed it, that when the market started falling apart, and Bernanke was asked, "Are you worried?" And subprime was falling down there. "Are you worried?" He said, "No, we had the problem contained." Well, it was contained to the world, that's true. But the United States, Europe, all went down. So he hadn't had it really contained. Diversification hadn't worked. He took that model, and a model that not only hadn't worked then, but hadn't worked in other cases. The world's had a lot of crises over and over again. The last big crisis was in 97, 98 in East Asia. And we already were in a world of diversification, hadn't worked then. But what interesting was that after the crisis, the IMF, the financial markets appealed to the U.S. Treasury and the governments all over the world to intervene to save the banks, And why did they say we're doing it? They always said, we're not doing it for our sake, but if you don't do it, there will be contagion, and others will fall, the whole global economy will go down into a problem. Okay? Well, when you use the word contagion, where does the word contagion remind you of? It's a metaphor from epidemiology, from diseases, that when one person touches another person or spreads, it goes around. Well, contagion is something that happens when you have globally integrated markets. If you don't have global integration, you don't have contagion. Contagion is the consequence of integration. So what was remarkable about these guys was that they touted the virtues of integration, diversification, all the benefits, until the problems occurred, and then they start talking about the problems of contagion. Now, you would have thought if you weren't schizophrenic, you would want to create a model that had both contagion and diversification inside the same model. And then you say, well, here are the benefits, here are the costs. How do we weigh that? What's the optimal degree of integration? It's a question that wasn't asked by a single one of these guys. And in fact, if you ask that, what you see is that the mathematical models they were using were models that were designed really not to address this issue. And this is where mathematics does really help you a lot. I think, and unfortunately, if you don't really understand mathematics, you're likely to just borrow assumptions without really understanding how the mathematics is really leading you to the wrong conclusions. So if you make mathematical assumptions of concave utility functions and convex production sets, in that particular model, diversification is always beneficial. You always reduce risk by spreading it, and you always get a more stable economic system. But there are many other models in which that is not true. Any model with bankruptcy, learning costs, trend reinforcement, lots of assumptions that are now every day, when we think about the world, violate those mathematical assumptions. Let me just give you an example from another field. Electric grids. If you have an electric grid, it saves on generating capacity when you have a larger integrated system. If you have each little town having its own electric system, it has to have its own generator, and you have to have enough capacity for excess capacity. As you get a bigger one, you can share the excess capacity in terms of surges among a larger part. And the United States and many other countries are getting more and more integrated grids. But what's the disadvantages of integrated grids that we found out about 25 years ago, 20 years ago? Some of you may be the result of that. Well, a blackout in a problem in one part, in one little town, one little place in Ohio, brought down the whole electric system in the east coast of the United States. So it was a problem of contagion, a problem one place spread around everywhere in the east coast of the United States. So excessive integration brings a problem. So what do people who are smart do about that? If you were just thinking about that for a moment, what would you say you need to do? Obvious thing. You create circuit breakers to make sure that you get the benefits of integration, but when you have these problems, you isolate. Well, metaphorically, in economics, capital controls are things like circuit breakers. But these guys who believed religiously in free and unfettered markets fought vigorously against capital controls, circuit breakers, because it was against the religion. And their mathematical models said it's a bad thing because their mathematical models only focused on the benefits of diversification, never had this other side into the model. And now some work that's going on, the work that I've done, I have a paper in the American Economic Review in this May, and other people are working in the same kind of area, are talking about optimal degrees of diversification, optimal network design, how you design linkages across banks, across countries, how that affects the systemic stability of the financial system or the economic system. It's really very exciting, both in mathematics and in economics. And it's actually, the getting application very quickly in places where people are very sensitive to these issues, like the Bank of England. The United States has been very slow to integrate this in, but the Bank of England is really, the head of their research department is really very much onto these issues. So that's one example there where I just want to highlight where economic ideas new ideas are affecting. And it's really interesting, the policymakers in the UK have been much more articulate in expressing a need for a new economic paradigm to help guide them in their policies. One more point before going on. Actually, I should probably open one more point I want to make, and then turn over to Rob, and or we'll have a few questions. Then I'll turn over to you. Okay. One of the areas of importance in economics, how can I've been talking a lot about economic theory, and there's wide areas of importance of economic data, and economic theory helps to shape how we interpret economic data. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. But one of the points I want to emphasize is how can economic theory by itself help us come to understand what is going on? And that is a very simple idea of robustness. One of the problems with the standard paradigm that was so influential for so long was wasn't very robust. Small changes in the assumptions led to very big changes in conclusions. So the model worked quite well, you might say, quite well, when you had perfect information. You could describe it. But you introduced just an epsilon amount, very small amount of imperfect information, irrational, imperfect expectations, inconsistent expectations, and all the results fall apart. So the model turned out to be not very robust. And obviously, since we can't be confident ever about the models that we use, we ought to be admit, and particularly in economics, because economics is unlike physics. In physics, when we study the atoms and we say something to the atoms don't change. They behave the way they do no matter what we think about them. Okay? But economics, unfortunately, if people have really stupid ideas, those ideas can have influence, and they may affect the way people behave. And so as we study, the objects that we study may actually change their behavior. And the world is always changing, so the things that we are, the world that we are studying is changing as we study it. So that should give us a certain amount of humility and a certain amount of caution whenever we study, make conclusions, policies, in economics. The import is that it's extraordinarily important for our models to be robust, that they can't be fragile. They can't be models that only hold if those assumptions are held precisely. They have to hold under a variety of assumptions. Let me just stop here and open it up for questions. There's a lot more I could talk about, and if there aren't questions, I may go on. But let me just stop here. Yeah.
So do you think regulation would somehow curb economic growth in addition to making the economy more stable?
No, quite the contrary. Good regulation, I think, will enhance economic growth. And let me just quote from Paul Volcker, who, by the way, is one of the supporters of INET. Paul said that there is not a single financial innovation that has enhanced the performance of the American economy except the ATM machine. And he was wrong in one way, because the ATM was not an American innovation. It was a UK. It was a UK innovation. But the fact is that most of those financial innovations were engaged in regulatory arbitrage, tax arbitrage, accounting arbitrage, and they enhanced the profits but didn't enhance economic efficiency. So let me make the more general point. The reason you have regulation is because of misalignment of incentives. Private incentives are not in accord with social incentives. The problem is that by making private incentives align with social incentives, you create a better functioning financial sector. Now, the problem with the current financial system is that it's been very unstable. And instability is very, very bad for economic growth. And I'm willing to venture that if you look at economic growth in the period, say 2000 to 2020, it will be a remarkably slow period of economic growth because we had the bubble and then we broke the bubble, and we're going to have very slow economic growth for a very long time. We are almost surely going into a Japanese-style malaise. So the fact is that there's extraordinary high cost for volatility. Forget about the human cost, but just from the growth cost. And that the final point I should probably make is we have to be very careful in measuring growth. And I think that's one of the things that the crisis should have talked to. Because much of the growth that occurred from 2003 to 2007 was phony. 40% of all investment was real estate. What do we know about those prices that they were recording for all those real estate investments? Phony. They were all based on bubble prices. More than 40% of all profits, all corporate profits, were in the financial sector. What do we know about those financial profits? Phony. They all disappeared in 2008, 2009. So those growth numbers had no reality. They're just fictions. That raises a very deep question of better measurement. And as long as I'm selling books, President Sarkozy and a lot of other political leaders have been very worried about this question, because they're worried about it because of the simple fact they're told to increase GDP, but they're told by their citizens to make us happy. And increasingly, they see those are two different things. GDP goes up, but our citizens are unhappy. And they say, can't you make, you're giving me two sets of directions, you're making my life terrible. Can't you give me a metric that says I do well if our economy does well, and our economy does well when our citizens are happy, okay? Well, that's too difficult to solve. But he asked us to, asked me to chair a commission on the measurement of economic performance and social progress to try to reduce the disparity between this, to talk about sustainability, because what was happening in the United States was not sustainable economically, also not sustainable environmentally or socially or politically. So there are really very, very important issues that a lot of when you say these regulations are bad for growth, talk about environmental regulations. No, I say if you measure things correctly, environmental regulations are good for growth. It's only if you don't measure things right that you come up with the wrong conclusion about it being bad for growth. That was a long answer to a short question. Yeah.
I think your views are backed by really convincing logic, and I think it makes total sense. So how is this still accepted by the academic or by the American policymakers? Because it seems like you've got powerful enemies.
Rob, do you want to take that?
Yeah.
You're on the other side of the establishment who are enjoying this.
There's a wonderful burgeoning market for bad information that, and I'm not kidding, think of information in kind of two ways. One is the value of it comes from what the investigation illuminates. You learn more about reality and you calibrate your actions in accord and do better as a result. The other use of information is essentially what a more benign term is marketing, which is if I can persuade you to change your actions based on a portrait that I paint, then when you change your actions, I can be more profitable. A very good example of this. You can see it on Fox News every day. Government is awful. Now, you and I, everyone in this room, knows that there have been experiences over the course of American history and cross-sectionally around the world today where there are examples of government working well. So it's not a logical truism that government is awful, even if we might agree that the American government in this recent period has been very dysfunctional. But the idea, which I think is kind of, I'm an American, so I'll call it anti-American. It's in the sense of being too pessimistic. The idea that you're always going to fail if you rely on government is a marketing ploy from people who don't want their behavior constrained by government. These are not people who are trying to, as Joe has written in a lot of his research and many other comments, the pervasiveness of market imperfections says that markets unfettered are not sufficient. Now these people, what I'll call the Fox News troupe, just for a metaphor, would say the cure is worse than the disease. And after watching the bailouts, they might be right. But in that episode, they might be right. And the question of, as Joe talked about and as we wrote about in the UN report, the pervasiveness of spillovers and externalities. You had some very wonderful revealed testimony in 2008. The banks are going over the cliff, and all the leaders, the brand name leaders, J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs, everybody say, you have to save us or the world's going down. They're revealing the existence of a spillover. Now that things are calm, anybody that wants to go and regulate them, which is a form of, to borrow a legal term, prior restraint, so that the spillovers cannot manifest, well, they've completely forgotten that day when they were going over the waterfall and needed help. So I guess the question, and one of the challenges for INET is how to build a culture and how to build a community which can resist those powerful interests with the logic that is convincing and textured so that the social good can be promoted, so that experts can regain their reputation for promoting the social good, and so that people become less and less numb and immune to information investigation because they think it's all cynical marketing material.
Yeah, and let me make two other comments. One of them is, this is a battle of ideas. I mean, we could be clear, but it's a battle of interest as well. It's ideas and interest, and they're interacting. In different places, these are playing out in different ways. So it's not the case that the dominance of the Anglo-American model is universal. In fact, in most of the world, I mean, you happen to be here in America, where the Anglo-American model is very strongly believed. But in much of the rest of the world, that's not true. And so, while there was a debate, skepticism of that model before the crisis, now I think the crisis has really tilted opinion very strongly against that Anglo-American view. So it was very interesting in the aftermath of the crisis, in say France and even Germany, a conservative political government, very strongly talking about the value of the European social model. So even the right, Sarkozy's on the right in France, even the right is talking about the need for the social safety net, industrial policy, a whole large range of views that are markedly different from you might say, the market fundamentalists that have prevailed in the United States in recent years. The second point I guess I make is that this is a battle of ideas that is obviously going to be going on at a number of different levels within the economics profession, but also in the broader citizenry in one way or another, and in a very intense way. And you see that in a way that I think one hasn't seen, I think, at least in my lifetime. A movie that is now opened up in the theaters called Inside Job, getting a lot of attention, and I should encourage you all to see it. So this is a movie going into ordinary theater, which is about the role of the economics profession in destroying the economy, and it stars people you wouldn't think normally that. People like the chairman of the Harvard economics department, the dean of the Columbia Business School, Larry Summers, star not in a way that is always attractive to them. I think they wish they weren't stars, but in other words, it really attacks many of these people, and in a very forceful and effective way. So there is a popular aspect to this that is going on. Yeah.
You were just talking about marketing and convincing people of the value of your ideas. It seems to me that the free market side of the debate has been better at marketing for quite some time. So I guess you must have thought about this. What are how you kind of get the marketing value?
What I would say is the people who have been, what you might say, willing to point out the flaws in the market have had almost a romantic view, which is if government can fix it, it will fix it. And the other side has tried to demonize the regulatory apparatus with what they call regulatory capture theories and other things that, like I said, the cure is worse than the disease. Ronald Reagan's, government is part of the problem, not the solution, and so forth, appeals to a kind of freedom. There's a famous writer, I think lived in England, named Isaiah Berlin. And he has a famous essay called Two Types of Freedom, or Two Types of Liberty. And what they are is the freedom from intrusion and the freedom to do what you want. And those can come into conflict, particularly when somebody doing something is large and has pervasive impact on others. What the advocates of government dysfunction have done is they've been very skillful with the use of repetition and anecdote and example. They've actually done a very good job of being synchronized, where 25 people appear on the media in the same 2 weeks, as though they're all independent commentators, but they're actually working off of the same talking points. I don't think the people on that progressive left side have been nearly as sophisticated in their media strategy. But we have, like I've mentioned with the bailout, served up some pretty good examples of the regulatory apparatus, Federal Reserve, FDIC, Securities and Exchange Commission, failing the common interest. So there are some irrefutable examples that would be discouraging. The other thing you find in psychological research is that the appeal to fear is much easier than the appeal to what you might call valor or goodness. People are much more quick to defend themselves than they are to be trusting. And I think this asymmetry, it's at some level why from the time of Bismarck, prime ministers and presidents have always been able to turn the public, inspire them to go to war by creating the fear of the enemy, the other, bothering you.
Can I make just two other comments? First is that actually these ideas, for a reason I don't fully understand, that some of the senior people in the UK have been much more receptive to these ideas than in the U.S. Adair Turner, who is the chief regulator, was the chief regulator of the banking system in the UK, is totally on board all the ideas that I've been talking about, and has been actually one of the people pushing for this kind of new paradigm. Andy Haldane, who is the chief of research of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, who is the governor of the Bank of England, arguing, for instance, and reading a lot of stuff that I and other people are writing, and he's saying, if you're too big to fail, you're too big to be. And so, really saying a very dramatic difference in regulatory regime. Now, he's not always succeeded, but at least in the UK, there is a very lively discussion. Same thing in France, and the same thing. So I think, in a way, in the US, you're getting it's a very important example, particularly since it was the country that caused the global crisis. But it is it is out of sync with much of what is going on in the rest of the world. The other point I think one has to bear in mind is a general point that has often been made in political economy, that there's always an imbalance between special interest and general interest. The special interests are concentrated and get very big benefits so that the financial sector is contributing $400 million during 2009 for preventing financial regulation. That's a lot of money, and it's very hard to raise money on the other side. So there's an imbalance, and part of the thing is that when you create very strong vested interest with locks that then get a lot of money, it's a self-perpetuating system.
Yeah, let me just add to that, because you use the United Kingdom as in contrast with the United States. The role of money in politics is much, much lower in the United Kingdom than it is in the United States. So if you think about elected officials have to appoint people, and elected officials who appoint people have to put them through a confirmation in Congress, the confirmation process in Congress, and those people have to be confirmed. And everybody who's making these decisions, whether to vote for confirmation, vote things out of committee, or appoint them, are all very dependent on political fundraising here. Someone like Adair Turner could never be appointed. The financial sector wouldn't tolerate it in the United States. And that's a broken part of government that warrants the public being suspicious.
You talked a lot about the limitations of a lot of the current models in economics, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on reforming those models to include lack of rationality or perfect competition, or whether we maybe need new ones rather than using the old ones as a basis.
Well, obviously, if those of the geniuses here ought to be creating new models, but the way research typically gets done, in a way, is that people take old models, they tweak them, and when they tweak them enough, they wind up with a new model. So that's just the way the thought. You keep changing it until you wind up in something that is actually markedly different, and that's just the way a lot of thought processes work. Occasionally, somebody really just makes a leap, but that's really very, very rare. And there've been there are lots of differing strands in economics that have been exploring various directions of generalization with a great deal of success. And the remarkable thing is that they've made a lot of inroads in many parts of economics, not in macroeconomics. There's something peculiar about that field that is resilient to new ideas. And so, to give you an example, game theory was very good about developing new ways of thinking about imperfect competition. Behavioral economics has been reasonably good about thinking about ways of dealing with behavior that's not quite rational, but is, even though it's not rational, it's systematic. So it's systematic enough that you can study it. It has regularities, patterns. And some aspects of behavioral economics have already come into influence in some of the policies the Obama administration used. Most of them didn't work, but they were at least trying new ideas in behavioral economics. The design of the tax cut, this was just Bush's tax cut in February 2008 was a dismal failure. Not surprising, because the point was with people with having an overhang of debt and uncertainty, didn't spend much of the money. Okay, and then when Obama had the tax cut in February 2009, they thought, well, maybe if we change the way people get their checks, it will be better. So rather than getting a one-time reduction, they reduced withholding. I think they reduced the withholding, and they would say, oh, everybody will see somehow that their check is $5 higher every week, and they'll go out and spend it rather than save it. It didn't work. So that was it. But it was an interesting idea to try it out and have a little experiment. I didn't think it was going to work because of the unusual circumstances. In other circumstances, it might have worked. Another thing that they tried in behavioral economics was the green shoot experiment. A good friend of mine, George Akerlof, and Bob Schiller wrote a book called Animal Spirits, talking about how if you could just get confidence up, you could get animal spirits and people would go out and spend. So the story is that Obama read the book and his team went out and started talking about, in March, green shoots. They passed the stimulus. Now they said the economy is going and green shoots were going to be there. Well, I thought, they had missed some of the fundamental reasons why the economy was not going to get going, especially the way they were repairing the banks and not dealing with the mortgages. Stimulus that was not well designed, was too small. So all the reasons that I said, look, if you talk about green shoots and summer comes and they all turn brown, you're going to get people feeling more pessimistic. And that's really what's happening now. So anyway, but there are lots of examples of things that people are doing that are actually very creative. You want to call? Oh, back there.
I thought the Sarkozy comment you brought up was interesting. The fact that he hears frustration that the GDP can go up while the living conditions can go down. So I guess the question I have is, what good is an economy if it doesn't serve the people? And if the trend is that not only does it serve the people less and less, but so inequality is rising, environmental destruction is rising. So
I agree with you.
Like kind of a tension if the economy doesn't serve the people or the planet.
No, I agree with you. That's what a lot of this is about. And it's trying to say we ought to be getting measures of whether we're doing well in terms of how well the economy is serving the people. And not only the people today, one of the major sections of our report was on the issue of sustainability. So you can't just look at today, you have to look at the future. And this is true not just environmentally, but even economically. Just to give you a little anecdote, in 1999, the IMF paraded Menem, the president of Argentina, in front of the IMF as the exemplar of good economic policy. The country had been growing very rapidly, according to GDP. But I knew, and people looking at the data, what the basis of that growth was. That growth was all based on consumption, based on debt. Now, does that sound familiar to any of you? Another country that had growth based on consumption and debt? Well, it was very clear that Argentina wasn't going to continue. And very shortly after that, Argentina really crashed. And people's response was, if the IMF calls this the A+ student, we don't want to be in that school. And the same thing, that United States growth was based on consumption supported by debt. It was not going to be sustainable. So our metrics ought to be giving us a better picture of what is going on. So the president can say, look how well we've done, we've grown, and the answer is, no, you haven't. You've grown in a way that's unsustainable, based on consumption, destroying the environment. Most people are worse off. And that's part of the discussion we ought to be having. What are the things that are really going to matter for today and the future? Okay.
Professor Stiglitz emphasizes slow growth of the U.S. in the foreseeable future. So in view of the rising competition from other nations in the globalizing world, or as Thomas Friedman said, the leveling of the playing field, what are your thoughts on how the U.S. could or should deal with this perceived relative economic decline?
Well, relative economic decline isn't a problem. If you go back to 1820, before your time,
You were around then.
I was around, but before your time, China and India had close to 50% of global GDP. And then a whole series of things happened. The Industrial Revolution that was more in the West, but also unfair trade treaties, colonialism, oppression, all kinds of things. And the result of this was that over the next 150 years, the share of India and China went down to under about 5%. So what you're seeing right now is a restoration of what is, you might say, is a more normal course of events, where GDP would correspond to shares of population. So there's not, if their growth, this can be a positive sum game. Their growth can help create demand for our goods and vice versa, and so that can be positive. The worry, though, is that no country, if you stand still, you fall behind. You have to run to stay where you are. And that even absolutely some of the things that we get income from, rents, we won't be able to do that in the future, because our some of the unique sources of income in the United States, for instance, United States gets a lot of rents from its advances in technology. Okay, well, we have been investing less in education and technology than some other countries have been doing, and that's going to mean that we won't be having we may not have the dominant role that we've had in the last 15 years. Much of what if you look at the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, a very large fraction are from abroad, because we often don't have as good, part of the reason is many of our best students are attracted to Wall Street. So one of the concerns about Wall Street and the financial market is not only did it distort the allocation of financial resources, it's distorted the allocation of our even more important human resources. But the concern is that as we've raised restrictions on visas and made it more difficult, it may become more difficult for us to access the human capital in the rest of the world. So there are a number of sources of concern, and what one sees, I can tell you a little story that at least gives you a little bit of a flavor. I don't know if it's a little bit maybe more anecdotal, but Columbia has some joint research programs with universities in China. And I was sort of curious. I said, I understand why they want us there. We have some really first-rate scientists. What is Columbia getting out of this? Just a question of curiosity. And I said, and the answer was, we can't afford the laboratories that China has. China has better laboratories than we can afford. The government's making a commitment to doing research, to advancing research, except that it's going to have 10 of the top universities in the world within a decade. So, that takes commitment. And what are we doing? We're underinvesting in these areas. Amherst is making a very big commitment to a science center, which may revolutionize American science, but it is moving in the right direction. But much of the rest of the country is not investing enough in science. Yeah.
I just want to thank you for coming. As an economics student, I'm ecstatic to hear someone challenge this neoconservative economics that they teach here. But kind of alluding to what you were just talking about and falling behind, social benefit in economics, it doesn't include taxes. And I think that's such a huge problem, and I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts are on it in terms of trying to maybe redefine social benefit, because in falling behind other countries, if we don't include taxes in social benefit, we're not redistributing any income back to our secondary education, which is probably some of the worst in the world. And I actually just created a special topics class, which I wanted to do in economics, but I know none of the professors were going to take me on. And it's kind of about the Washington consensus against the Beijing consensus. And that whole model of thinking, because it's very upsetting seeing that we as a country are just going to continue to fall farther and farther behind just because of this ignorance of trying to change our own thought. And my question more or less is, what are your thoughts on this Chinese model and their new economic thinking and that moving forward? And the dominance, because you see places in Africa in particular where it's such an untapped market. China, more so than us, are taking those next steps to reinvest in technology and students and education, everything you were alluding to before, which we're not doing at all. And so I'm actually going to be working for UBS come next summer in fixed income. So I was wondering if you could also come talk to us. And maybe, but I'm saying though, the thing is, people don't realize we are falling behind. So at least if you can come and maybe even talk and bring some light to what's actually happening, raise some money as well at the same time, why not?
Let me make a couple comments on a number of questions you raised. One of the interesting things about the crisis, and one of the real sources of concern, is that it's not just that in GDP we're falling behind, but we may be in the process of destroying human capital. The point is the following, that when individuals remain unemployed for extended periods of time, they become less productive. They lose their skills. It's a phenomena I'm sure you've studied in your ordinary courses called hysteresis. So if the characteristic of the United States in the past of unemployment is that people go into unemployment and out of it very quickly. But the duration of unemployment now is at a record level since the records have ever been kept. And more than 40% of Americans who are unemployed have been unemployed for more than 6 months. And that means that when they do get a job, almost surely the wages will be lower than they otherwise would have been. But from a macro point of view, Europe went through this period in the 80s, and it's very hard. Once you get unemployment up high, very hard for an extended period of time to bring it down. So there's beginning a discussion in the United States of what they call the new normal, that rather than aspiring to get the unemployment rate down to 5% of what that it was in the early days of 2000, let alone the 4.2% that it was in the 90s, the new normal will be 7-8%, and it will be very difficult for us to get below that. If that's true, it's going to be a whole set of problems for our budget, for our society. But the unemployment rate right now of youth is about 20%, is about 2 times the rest than the rest, twice as high as the rest of the country. So really a set of problems that we are beginning to fester. The UK has taken a very different view under Brown, not under the new government. Under Cameron, it's been a move in the other direction. But under Brown, the view was very strongly any young people who doesn't have a job should either be in a school or a training program. So they increased spending. What has the United States been doing? Cutting back spending on education. So just the opposite. So they recognize this is a time we ought to be strengthening our human capital, not destroying it. A broader issue in China, and Tom Friedman's been writing a lot about this, and he's absolutely right. They took the opportunity of the stimulus to say, they read our textbooks. They were the best student of American economics, and they read our textbooks. They understood Keynesian economics. They didn't have this ideology about, free market solving all problems. They weren't hung up. They have other hang-ups, let me say, but they don't have that hang-up. So they saw the crisis. They understood the need for Keynesian economics, had a huge stimulus. It worked. But they said, we ought to be spending at least a significant fraction of this improving the long-term productivity of our economy. So they created a high-speed national railroad system in a span of a couple years, 2-3 years. Now, in the United States history, we make a great deal about the role that the creating of the highway across the country, unifying the West Coast and the East Coast. It changed America's geography, economic geography. Well, the high-speed railroad is going to have an even bigger impact on China.
Those of you who have seen the movie Dr. Strangelove, which probably not too many of you, the 1961 film about nuclear war, the actor who was Peter Sellers is the big star. He plays 3 different roles, but the actor who was considered the leading actor at the time is a man named Sterling Hayden. And he wrote a book about his decision at one point to take a break and go sail around the South Pacific. And he wrote a book called Wanderer. And in Wanderer, Hayden talks about the library that he wanted to put on this book, on his boat, the nature of the books that he would read. And he takes you on a tour through all the different things, Shakespeare and the Greek plays and all this kind of stuff. And then he comes into the passage in the book and he says, but the most interesting literature is about the problems between man and man. And he talks about the various sociologists and Marx and Ricardo and the economists, and he says that realistically, it's all about the difficulties of man dealing with each other. Joseph Schumpeter was once asked, what is economics about? And he said, that's simple, 3 things, politics, politics, and politics. And what I think we have done in the economics profession with its fascination of borrowing from physics as a discipline in natural science is we've tried to create the illusion of mechanical markets and the illusion of stability. And those portraits, those psychological portraits that are being painted and marketed are essentially a coded politics. And as politics becomes more tense, people become afraid to engage. And you see in economics now that those people who would be looked upon in a friendly manner by the development departments of a university, meaning they espouse the views of the strong and the wealthy, are quite vigorous in talking about public policy. And those who disagree recede into the monastery and talk about mathematics and technique. And while I would encourage all of you to become economists right now, because the consensus and the intimidation associated with the tribal rhythms of the fundamentalist paradigm have just broken down, it's very important now to create cultures. It's very important to create, if you will, our own tribe of people that can resume economics with a social purpose. Economic problems that have to do with moral purpose, economic thinking and logic that addresses the problems of the world are very important as motivation. It's very hard to have a satisfying career feeling like you're avoiding the big game and what's really going on in society. Lots of people that I know from my generation who were trained, I did a PhD in economics, either went to work in policy or went to work at places like hedge funds, like I did for a while. I worked with George Soros, because they didn't think they could study the real world in the academic context. I think that's changing now, and I certainly, with this Institute of New Economic Thinking and the people like Joe that are on my advisory board, we're attempting to raise $300 million. George Soros has offered $100 million to fertilize this new thinking with research grants to individuals like yourselves who can apply for a grant. We call those kind of the grants that pull us. You define your curiosity and inspire our research jury. The other kind of grant I'll call a task force, or what we call a push grant, where the board decides what are the themes that are important. We've talked a little bit back and forth today about political economy, how markets are not mutually exclusive from politics, but they are intertwined. The role of expectations and the instability of expectations, philosophies of regulation and how that relates to political economy. There are task forces that we're setting up on curriculum in economics, both graduate and undergraduate curriculum. I went to MIT as an undergraduate, and I was very fond of mathematics. And one approach to learning about economics is to work within a mathematical modeling framework, change assumptions, look at the implications, and then look out to the world to see how different vision that's created from the mathematics can be applied to real concerns. Joe's done a tremendous job of that in his research on asymmetric information and other market imperfections, and there's a great deal of way in which you've influenced policy and perceptions of policymakers through that research. But the other side, which is I will call that the deductive agenda, people deducing insights from working with the logic. The other side is the inductive agenda. People who study economic history and look for parallels to the present circumstance and the present challenges are not well supported. I went to MIT as an undergraduate. Charles Kindleberger was the man that Joe mentioned, was an economic historian. Peter Temin, who retired last year, was also a great influence on my becoming an economist. When Peter retired, MIT decided they are not going to replace him with there is not going to be an economic historian on the faculty. Henry Kaufman, who's one of the most famous financiers in New York, was the kind of leader of research at Salomon Brothers in its formative days. Last 2 or 3 years has endowed chairs at Columbia Business School and at NYU in economic and financial history, because he's afraid that the people who are coming to Wall Street don't understand they live in that illusion of stability of the efficient market hypothesis and rational expectations, and they don't understand what kind of things can and do happen, not only in financial markets, but socially. And a look at the 1930s is rather frightening if you think we are in a period of stagnant and dysfunction now. But so the inductive agenda, looking at history, looking at current problems, looking at the history of economic thought. Who are these guys? Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, Marx. Is this what you might call a logical progression or a Darwinistic competition for the best ideas? Or did those ideas occur in a context where there are vested interests, where there are what you might call conditions of society that inspire their perspective or their insights? Is the way David Ricardo looked at trade, where comparative advantage depended upon the natural endowments that came essentially from God or the Creator or Mother Nature, whoever you want to call it, land endowments, deposits of oil, or is comparative advantage something that's created now out of knowledge and out of learning, and that the pattern of comparative advantage is something that can change over time and is within human control and therefore subject to an economic strategy? I think the Japanese, the Chinese, the Koreans are showing that dimension, and the Germans have as well. So history of economic thought, which understands context, inspiration, vested interests, opponents, may be an interesting guide for how you understand contemporary economic theory and the challenges of being creative. Being creative is not easy, whether you're a novelist, a filmmaker, or an economic theorist. It's a very delicate, it's a very emotionally demanding activity. We are in a period right now where people are very concerned. There's a tremendous amount of stress in society right now because things are in transition and in flux. But those are the periods when people make very, very creative contributions. And we have a website that's called ineteconomics.org, INET, for Institute of New Economic Thinking. There must be 50 or 60 video lectures that are up there now. Joe mentioned Adair Turner. He gave a barn-burning dinner speech at our first conference for about an hour that will convince you that the British oratory tradition is something we haven't mastered in the United States. His delivery is it's almost Shakespearean. But there are many things. Joe has a very nice lecture about future directions in economic theory and various interviews and so forth. We have our social networking dimension to the website. We are going to post blogs and working papers. One of the things I promised to do is we're working very closely with the with the Financial Times of London. I think everybody who's interested, whether you're an economics major or not, should get one of these student subscriptions to the FT, because you enter a conversation about what's happening, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And they have op-ed contributors about how the German guy sees it, or the Japanese guy sees it, or the Americans. They have some excellent columnists like Martin Wolf, and who really illuminate what the contemporary problems are, the real problems that can inspire your focus and your interest. We're going to create some blog posts on our website where someone interprets the FT's article of the day or of the week or something that's particularly creative or interesting, and try to give people what you might call an assist, a way in to this. We do have convenings. The next major convening will be in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at the hotel, was it Mount Washington Hotel, where the original Bretton Woods Agreement, the international monetary system, was signed after World War II. And we'll have regional meetings on things like the economics of innovation, probably in the San Francisco Bay Area, first quarter of next year. But more importantly, I want to inspire your curiosity to come to this website, to come learn about us, to sign up to be notified, watch what we're doing, apply for grants, and try to how'd I say, gain some nourishment from us, join our community, and become part of the nourishment and the strength of this new tribe that has to do better than the last tribe did. Otherwise, we'll be like the Mayan civilization and just lie there in ruins. So, at any rate, let's go back to some questions. Yep.
Are the institution also collaborating with some other government? I can totally see the Chinese government would love you guys.
Well, George Soros and I, Joe's a rock star in China, just like he is here. But George Soros and I in May went over to China and we did roundtables at Tsinghua University, Beijing University, Fudan University. And, I thought we were going in and the faculty would be like 5 or 6 and George and I, and we'd have a nice conversation. Except I didn't realize there would be an audience of 600 or 800 people on the side. That's part of working with George Soros. He's kind of a global star, but the people were very enthusiastic and very engaged there. Similarly in India, I was there just in the 2 weeks after that. And by the way, one of the things INET will do is we're setting up institutions embedded inside of universities in different places or inside of interesting think tanks and learning centers in some places. And I would imagine we will have places like Brazil, China, and India will be part of this network, as well as London and East Coast universities, West Coast universities in the United States, France and Italy, Germany. These are the kind of things that are on the drawing board. We're trying to build a global network of people, with the American paradigm being somewhat on the defensive. At some level you kind of go up against the resistance, but at some level kind of a judo move is to go look around the rest of the world and find the people who are naturally wanting to create a way from that stagnant, unsatisfying vision of how the economy works. And at any rate, you're right, there is a lot of enthusiasm there.
I was just going to say, I guess you talked about how inequality has become, I guess, like something that we definitely need to think about going forward. And I guess, capitalism doesn't really have, inequality or like equality at the heart. Equality is not at the heart of capitalism. So I guess, now that, I'm trying to think about how do we then rethink capitalism with a focus on equality. Do we then even start to think that maybe capitalism, do we even start to think about breaking down what we've been thinking or what we've been saying about capitalism?
Yeah, what is actually striking is in most graduate courses, the core graduate courses in economics, there's almost no discussion of inequality, either the causes of inequality or the consequences of inequality. And yet, what's so clear is that one of the major concerns in society today is the growth in inequality. That raises a number of issues. The first is, why is there this inequality and why is it growing? The standard paradigm, and the crisis has actually helped bring to fore some of these questions. The standard answer that goes back to the 19th century was that inequality is explained by differences in people's productivities. You can explain prices of apples and oranges by demand and supply. You explain relative wages by the same demand and supply. Okay? And then the inference from this was that the reason some people get more income was that they were more productive. So the explanation of inequality was at the same time a justification for the inequality, and it made it more acceptable. The reason the crisis in many ways is a crisis in capitalism is that everybody saw all these people getting these huge bonuses, not on the basis of performance. They had record losses. Okay, they called them performance bonuses, but they were record losses. And so all of a sudden it brought home a very simple point. In a modern economy, the link between productivity and performance is extraordinarily weak. And so this theory that had been developed over 100 years has really been undermined. Now, that doesn't answer the question. It says what's wrong with the old theory. It doesn't say what is the correct explanation. And that's going to be a more difficult story. But one of the, work has been chipping away at some of these older ideas. The old idea of demand and supply had come to the view, if you try to impose a minimum wage to make sure that the people at the bottom get away, it will cause unemployment because you're interfering with the market. Well, some very important research by two labor economists, Berkeley and Princeton, showed that that was not true. So that both at the top and the bottom, the inequalities at the extreme top and the bottom have really been attacked by recent research that really have called into question the determinants. But at this juncture, we really don't have a fully coherent theory. We have pieces of imperfect competition, monopoly power, and so forth, imperfect information, fragmented markets. We have lots of pieces, but we don't really have the full story.
With regard to your question and your theme, we did have a session at our first conference in Cambridge, England last spring on the causes and consequences of inequality. And there's a World Bank economist named Branko Milanovic who did a very, very interesting portrait of what were the causes of inequality and how it related to things like your parents' wealth and what country you were born in and what could be explained, not justified, but explained. And the second was a woman named Kate Pickett, who, along with a man named Wilkinson, wrote a book called The Spirit Level. And it's a study, there are two studies within the book. One is a cross-sectional study of the world, and the other is a cross-sectional study of the 50 states in the United States, looking at the consequences of inequality and all kinds of measures of what you might call social happiness or dissatisfaction. Incarceration rates, drug abuse rates, suicide rates, all these kinds of things. And what they found was that in countries above a certain level of, beyond subsistence level, growth in income did not produce happier societies. Growth or narrowing in the distribution of income improved much. The social indicators all improved very markedly. Or alternatively, when things become more unequal, all the symptoms of social dysfunction and discord emerge. And it was true, fit like a glove, looking at the empirical data in the book, both across the 50 United States and across the planet. And so this is what you might call a thrust towards the economics profession, saying the consequences of inequality, even for the wealthiest 20% in very unequal societies, it's not that they're a lot better off and everybody's worse off. The top 20% exhibit a lot of these negative social symptoms when they are embedded in an unequal society.
I'd like you to clarify a little bit what the implications are of your ideas for how economics is actually done. One criticism of economics as a science is that like a marine biologist would go and swim with dolphins or something to do the science. And you're advancing a lot of interesting ideas here, but I'm wondering if what's involved with that is maybe more field work oriented economics or behavioral science centered economics, and I wonder beyond the theories, what actually has to be done.
We'll probably both try to take a stab at that. The first observation is that one of the things that happened to the economics profession was that it became, I think, excessively narrow in some areas. I mean, it's still very broad, but in some areas, particularly macroeconomics, excessively narrow, and particular models came to be dominant, and the concern is particularly that those models were particularly bad. I mean, if they were good models, one might be. But so why is that important? Well, diversity of ideas is very important if you're going to get a flourishing of intellectual life. And what happened, and I'm thinking now more about a particular, say, brand macroeconomics, the kind of ideas, very important, that influence Bernanke, influence central bankers all over the world. So these are not fringe, these are ideas that really had a lot of influence, was that there was a very narrow set of ideas that came to dominate in these circles. And methodologically, they were, for the most part, very deductive, okay? That they began with very strong structures of what are acceptable, rational individuals, perfect information, or rational expectations, a really narrow set confine. And then they did empirical work using those models, but then again using very particular methodologies for verification, testing, for instance, correlations between two variables, okay, as a indicator that the model went well, rather than whether the model predicts recessions or depressions, whether it may do well most of the time but fail very badly exactly when we want a good model. When the growth of the economy is 3% year after year, doing well then, going from 3 to 3.1 is not a big deal. But if you miss the big deal, which is a recession or a big inflation, then the model really ought to be rejected. So one is a plea for diversity of ideas. But the second is also a plea, as you say, is a plea for a diversity of approaches of how you get your ideas and how you come to view them as reasonable. So Rob was talking about economic history as one example where if you want to understand the recession, you might want to look at the depression, but you also might want to look at what happened in Argentina's recession. The recessions were all over the world. And you want to look at it not within a particular lens, because a lot of people have done it with a particular lens, but you want to look at a variety of lenses for seeing what went on. Behavioral economics is another set of maintained hypotheses about how you might explain it. So they began with a very set of strong maintained hypotheses, rational expectations, and that was such a blinder that they couldn't see other explanations that might be better explanations for what went on. Do you want to?
Yeah. No, or alternatively, once you're in a peer-reviewed journal and everybody in this macroeconomic subset, the people who are nominated as referees or editors, all like this, what you might call fad of this particular modeling structure, the fact that it misses or doesn't explain the data, in other words, doesn't correspond to what you might call the scientific feedback of testing, just doesn't matter. So it gets published anyway because it's affirming the research agenda of a small group of people. That's not a healthy approach to what you might call the collective inquiry that we're all engaged in. And there has to be some inspiration and purpose that comes from without.
And let me try to just give one or two examples of bad examples, okay? One of them was, and this is more about central bankers, but it illustrates macroeconomists because macroeconomics played a very big role in central banking. At the end of the 70s, early 80s, a particular doctrine became dominant among central bankers called monetarism. And they had a high priest called Milton Friedman, got a Nobel Prize, went around the world to central bankers. They all adopted this religion. And it was a very nice one. It said that central banks should increase money supply at a constant rate. And no matter what, and it was if you didn't do this, if you didn't believe in monetarism, you wouldn't get invited to the conferences and you would be ostracized, and that's why I said it was a social phenomenon as well as, but they would publish papers, okay, about why this was the right model, until the evidence was so strong that it was a bad model that even the central bankers had to reject it. But the economics profession was out there talking about monetarism. And it was almost embarrassing because the economics profession was supporting the idea until it became almost a laughable idea. Well, more recently, inflation targeting has taken that same role. And the view was that if you just targeted inflation, you would get not only price stability, but you would also get stable economic growth. Well, after the crisis, anybody who, we didn't get stable economic growth. Okay, so now the central bankers have said, no, that's not enough. We have to do something else. So that's one of the reasons why this is a wonderful time, because the model, monetarism broke down, and now this model is breaking down. There's another example in a narrower way, and this is a narrow way. There's an idea, I don't know how many of you know, called the Modigliani-Miller theorem, which basically was a result that said that cash flow, the way a firm finances itself isn't important. Cash flow isn't important, okay? It was a theorem that, like any theorem, is true sometimes and not others. It just so happens isn't true in this world. But there might be another world in which it's true. But it's a very nice theorem, and it makes a very important point. I mean, it really has a lot of insight to it. But there were people doing models in investment, trying to explain investment, where the first paper that was written in this area was written just about the same time of Modigliani-Miller, and it came out with the result that cash flow mattered. But then Modigliani-Miller proved the theorem that said cash flow can't matter, and then you couldn't publish a paper that said cash flow mattered, because theory had shown that it couldn't matter. So the doctrine became so strong that the only papers that could get published had to assume it didn't matter, and you had to work within that confines. And then eventually I showed, and some other people showed, that if you change the assumptions about perfect information, it did matter, okay? Cash flow did matter. And then finally, it took about 20 years, 15 years, before it became acceptable to put cash flow in an investment equation. And when you did that, you found out, guess what? It did matter. So those are the blinders. And so a lot of this is trying to remove the blinders that have shaped economists, modeling. But by studying economic history of economic thought, what goes on in different countries, you help remove those blinders. Because institutions differ across countries. We come to understand our institutions and take them for granted. And one of the reasons why it's always useful to have a lot of students from different countries is because they come with different experiences and they don't take for granted the same things that sometimes we take for granted. Yeah?
You have talked a lot about what the government and the Fed have done wrong that led to the financial crisis. Could you now talk a little bit more about what you think they have done right to rectify the problem? The measures they've taken, the tax cuts, the stimulus package, just how effective are they? And are they as effective as they should be, considering it's such, just a huge amount of money?
That's both a very short and a very long answer. The short answer is they've done miserably. The little longer answer is they did much better than President Bush. But okay, let me give you just very briefly. The stimulus was too small, not well enough designed, and the result of that is the economy is still in a mess, and the stimulus is coming to an end, and very unlikely we'll get a second round of significant stimulus, and we really need it. We didn't do anything about the homeowners, which is where the crisis began, and so the number of foreclosures is actually increasing, not decreasing. There are probably 3 million Americans that will lose their home, and this year, 2 million last year, 2 million the year before. So we have a real social problem, and that didn't do very much about that. The best that you can say of monetary policy is that the provision of liquidity prevented the meltdown after they make such a big mess. But monetary policy, lowering interest rates to zero, has not reignited the flow of capital, and that's partly because the way we restructured the banks, we focused all on the big banks. We didn't put good regulations. We didn't use the regulations to encourage banks to go into what they should be doing as lending. We allowed them to continue to do the speculation, the gambling, the derivatives that they so risky and is not. So the result of this is that there's not credit going into the economy. Quantitative easing, which is the new form where interest rates, short-term interest rates are already at zero, so the government is now, the Fed is buying long-term bonds, trying to push down the interest rate, get the price of long-term bonds up, reduce the short-term interest rate, is not going to lead to more lending in the United States in any substantial amount, not going to affect the United States very much directly, a little bit, but not. The main attempt is competitive devaluation. Will weaken the dollar, because when the interest rate gets lower, the dollar gets weaker. But other countries are not very happy about this. This is the new form of beggar thy neighbor policies, and they're responding. One of the ways they're responding is not allowing their exchange rate to appreciate as much as we would like. And that's the discussion you've heard in the last week or two of currency wars. So we are really the country that is really igniting these currency wars, contributing to global instability, but not, as I say, the problem is it's not leading to really reigniting investment growth in the United States. So if you ask me what is the single most important thing we ought to do, it's the second round of stimulus, this, fixing the banks, getting them really back to lending, and doing something about the homeowners. In my book, Freefall, I actually give a proposal of what we ought to be doing about this. Do you want to add anything to that, Rob?
I'll go back to your question. That they did a stimulus program was better than not doing one. The composition of it, which they focused on shovel-ready, as they called it, quick injections of money, was probably unfortunate in one respect, which is when Franklin Roosevelt did his New Deal programs, you saw things like the Triborough Bridge, or in San Francisco, the Bay Bridge, and people say, what did they do with the money? And you could point at these things, and they were tangible. You knew what they were. The shovel-ready money can be confused with welfare. I'm suffering, and they gave my future money away to other people, and I didn't get anything for it. There's no like tangible prize. I also think it was a very odd circumstance to have lots of construction workers laid off. The American Society of Civil Engineers before the crisis was talking about $1.5 trillion agenda just for doing repair of our infrastructure. And we sat there and watched the unemployed construction workers atrophy and didn't repair our infrastructure because we said it has to be shovel ready and those things take too long to get going. I think that's a huge mistake. Joe, you said pretty much everything about the banking stuff. They should have recapitalized the banks, diluted the stockholders, changed the managements, and capped the perspective for bonuses while these things are still on life support, which they are even at this moment. And to tolerate that sows the seeds of social discord. And it's a cowardice that I think relates to money and politics.
And unfortunately, it makes it much more difficult now to get the second round of stimulus than the other actions that are needed. And unfortunately, because the problem is so global now, the consensus that there was for at one moment, everybody was a Keynesian, stimulus from Europe and America, that's frayed. And so right now what's going on in Europe is austerity measures likely to dampen their economies, and that will reinforce the weakening of the American economy.
Soros said last week, I was with him at the IMF meeting, and he said, in that period of late 2008, beginning of 2009, people were afraid, and the bankers were afraid. And that's the kind of time, as Milton Friedman used to say in his book, Capitalism and Freedom, when economists with plans can come in a crisis and really transform things. And that fear has dissipated. The financial sector has now got all kinds of support systems. The rest of the economy is not doing so well, but it's not nearly as powerful politically. And so at some level, we did miss the shot to do profound transformative work. And without the financial sector participating in the coalition that gives political validity to the transformation, it will be very hard to make it come to fruition.
Let me thank all of you, because we've been going for over 2 hours. So a few of you, if you have questions, we can come up and ask us at the end. And that's the website that you can go to, that we'll get some more.
I've got a pocket full of business cards if anybody wants to send me an email and correspond about what we're doing or what you'd like us to be doing. You can go, I'll make sure you contact me as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. I have one last thought for you. When I was an undergraduate at MIT, Joe Stiglitz had been a graduate student a few years before. And somebody was telling me about him. We hadn't met, but I was getting ready to apply to graduate school, and they wanted me to go where he was, which was Princeton, which I ended up doing. And Robert Solow, a famous Nobel Prize-winning economist, said something about Stiglitz. He said, I don't know. There must have been something in the water in Gary, Indiana, or Amherst, Massachusetts. And I laughed at the time. I just thought of that as we were talking tonight, because if there was something in the water then, it's still there now. And many of you have a chance to be the next Joe Stiglitz and really make a difference to this profession. Thanks.